The following program is a UW-TV classic.
I want to ask you with this new book, the publisher is giving it a lot of publicity, you're heading off on a book tour. Are you ready to be famous?
I guess so.
From the University of Washington in Seattle, Upon Reflection.
Is Charles Johnson ready to be famous? We'll find out today on Upon Reflection. I'm Marcia Alvar. I first posed that question to Johnson in the summer of 1990. His novel Middle Passage had just been published, and it looked like this might be the book to put Johnson on the map, as indeed it did. Middle Passage won the 1990 National Book Award. It's the only work of fiction for that year to receive dual nominations for that award and for the National Book Critics Circle Award. Charles Johnson teaches creative writing at the University of Washington when he's not busy being interviewed for People magazine. So were you ready to be famous?
Not quite. It was a greater response than I actually saw coming into the ceremony on November 27th. After I won, the support was tremendous from old friends all around the country, former students I've had. You know, I've been in the book world, I suppose, publishing for about 20 years. So I know people at universities all over, writers all over the country, and they all called at once within the first 2 weeks. It was like 30 or 50 calls a day, really, in the beginning, and a ton of mail that it's going to take me until the year 2000 to answer.
When we had that conversation last summer, this is what you said when I probed you a little bit more about being famous. You said, well, if you got famous, you might get a little bit busy, but I like to be busy.
I do like to be busy, maybe not this busy. It means that a lot of people call me for things, speaking engagements, writing for films, things they want me to write for newspapers and magazines. So it's really quite good. I just need a little time for things to settle down, I think, before I can get back to a regular schedule.
If you can take yourself back to that night at the Plaza Hotel in late November, everyone sitting around the ballroom waiting for the word to be given about who won the award, and just what it was like for you the moment you found out you had won.
Well, you know, the week before the ceremony, I had prepared an acceptance speech. What I really wanted to do, if I won, and I didn't know if I was going to win or not, was read a tribute to Ralph Ellison, whose Invisible Man, I think, is one of the great American novels of the 20th century. Writing it was hard, because I didn't know if I was going to win or not. So when I finally came to the ceremony, I was ready in case I did win. But I think what's most important is that that room was full of people who represent American history. Not just Mr. Ellison, but Saul Bellow was there, writer Russell Banks was there, Gloria Naylor was there, Terry McMillan was there, William Gass was there. When I won, I felt a sense of relief, I think, more than anything else, and then I could give my speech and then commune with other writers. I think what we all had was a real sense of history that night, more than anything else. And that little controversy that they had with Paul West, I think, passed away very quickly after the ceremony was over.
As you just mentioned, the controversy, West, a member of the judging panel, what exactly was his problem with the nominees?
I'm not exactly sure what his problem was. I was a judge in 1988, along with Joyce Carol Oates, when we selected Paris Trout by Pete Dexter. As one of the 5 judges, none of us would go to the press prior to the announcement. I suppose Mr. West was irritable, perhaps, because there were so many writers of color represented. You know, not just me, but also Elena Castedo, Jessica Hagedorn, and even Joyce Carol Oates' book is about a racial incident. I don't know why he found that troubling, because those books are really quite fine novels.
It's always been such a part of your own personal philosophy that art and writing have to be judged on an even field aesthetically, that one set of criteria can't be set for one group of writers, one criteria is set for another. Through that controversy, you never felt rankled that somehow this playing field you had so ardently supported wasn't being allowed?
Well, in some of the reports, the newspaper and magazine stories after the event. Some of the writers pointed out that I have been talking for years about one standard for writers, and so Mr. West's comments really had no applicability, didn't apply at all to my fiction. I still believe that. I still believe that we have one artistic and one aesthetic standard.
Now, Middle Passage was your 7th book, was your 3rd novel.
Right.
What was it about this book that captured people's imagination?
Oh, it's hard to say. On one level, I think I might want to propose that this book is perhaps more entertaining. It's more of an adventure story than my previous 2 novels. I built it, I structured it in such a way that there would be no breathing space for the reader. You would be propelled from the opening chapter to the next one, and it wouldn't let up until the last chapter when Rutherford Calhoun finally gets back from sea and is reunited with his sweetheart, Isadora Bailey. I think that had something to do with the fact that it's an adventure story. But there's another factor as well. This book comes at a time when across America, academics, university professors, people at colleges, and elsewhere are discussing the question of the canon. The great books, what books should we teach, what should be on the curriculum, how many minority writers, African-American writers, writers of color should be represented in the canon. So it fit into that debate, and I believe people are still reading it for that reason as well. One reason is because it does blend, I believe, African-American history on the one hand with a great deal of Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy. So all of that is held together, sort of synthesized in one book, so you don't have to have this polarized situation where either you throw out the 16 white males and Emily Dickinson, okay, and include writers of color. I think you can have both. I think that several traditions are merged in Middle Passage.
You mentioned the names of a couple of the characters. Rutherford Calhoun, who is a freed slave who ends up going on a slave ship traveling to Africa. He's a kind of a scoundrel. He's trying to escape New Orleans, some bad debts, a woman who wants to marry him and he's not ready. This book has a lot of layers, as you said. It's philosophical. It builds on the slave narrative, but it's a yarn. It's a great story.
Oh, first and foremost, I wanted this book to be an entertainment. When I read fiction, there's 3 things I look for, always 3 things. I want to laugh, and I want to cry, and I want to learn something during the process of reading a book, a work of fiction. So I tried to provide enough comedy, enough humor, enough tragedy, a plot that really is Aristotelian, in its movement. All the things that we know about great literature in the past, I tried to not impose so much as bring forth in the writing of this novel. So I do hope, in fact, it is a rousing sea adventure story.
I think one of the things that really threw critics about the book is this combination of the deeply intellectual tradition and yet a very almost cheeky, contemporary style to it. And Calhoun, Rutherford Calhoun, the lead character, really, he's a man of the 19th century and very much a man of the 20th century.
The reason for that probably is my own schizophrenic personality. Rutherford says his own language is a blend of, street and seminary. And I guess I've been on both the street and close to the seminary, at least in terms of philosophy seminars. He speaks much the way that I do. I also wanted to give him a comic element. One reviewer made the remark in the New York Review of Books, I believe, that he's like a 20th century comedian projected back into the early 19th century. And that's fairly accurate. He makes observations that I think are witty sometimes, and then at the same time, that are very, very philosophical. He has to be able to do that. I feel as a narrator. He has to be able to observe everything going on around him during the middle passage for the sake of the reader, to be the most effective guide through this horrific event that the slaves are going through. So he doesn't miss anything.
The reviewer in the New York Times Review of Books, there's a wonderful couple of sentences in that review about Middle Passage where he said that that there was an endearing and determined recklessness about your writing, and that you broke the rules of writing with heretic abandon.
Yeah, it was Thomas Keneally. I appreciated his review. I wasn't quite sure why he said some of those things. As soon as somebody tells me I break rules, my first question is, whose rules? And where do these rules come from? Very often, I think, in creative writing, we have to look at what has become a rigid formula in writing and question whether or not it is truly effective or not. When I'm writing a novel, I don't even think of it as a novel. I'm not saying to myself, I'm writing a novel. What I'm doing is I'm listening to the characters, I'm trying to figure out what they're going to do next, and when the book is done, then I look back upon it and I say, that fits the characteristics of a novel. But I'm not saying that in my mind in advance. What I'm doing is trying to tell a story, first and foremost.
So you didn't feel like you were taking any great risks. You didn't feel like you were doing something heretical as you were writing this book.
Well, I knew it wasn't a strictly naturalistic novel, but neither are my previous two books. I knew that, sometimes I would throw in an anachronism from the 20th century in the language that wouldn't fit, right, the 19th century. But for me, the important thing is balance. What effect, aesthetic effect, is it having at that moment? And if it has the right effect, then I'll take the risk. I really will. I will do anything to get a joke into my fiction. And also, if the risks are in the service of a greater meaning than just breaking the rules, then I think the risks make sense.
You spent a good many years researching, getting ready to write this book. You spent a good many years writing it. And as I was reading about what went into writing this book, I was reminded of a friend who made a film. And he said halfway through the making of the film, it was as though all he could remember were the mistakes, the things that had gone wrong. And about halfway through, he had a kind of crisis of faith where he was ready to tell the people who'd given him the money to make the film, I'll give all the money back. I just don't think I can go forward.
Oh, that's scary.
Did you ever have a point like that in writing this book after all these years, this much investment, that whoops, this wasn't working out?
Well, I spent 18 years really on the research of the slave trade and the 19th century, and 6 years on this book from 83 to 89. And I wrote the first draft in about 9 months. I was teaching, and so I did in fact hurry it because I promised it to my agent. She went crazy over the first 2 chapters. And I said, okay, that was during the summer of, I believe, 83, so I'll finish it by the next summer. And it was really too fast. I took shortcuts I shouldn't have taken. And we both looked at it, and we both came to the mutual decision that this needs a bit more time. So I took another 5 years going over it and over it and over it. The earlier draft of that book came out much different. Rutherford Calhoun does not get the girl, his brother does at the end of the book. Squibb does not survive, but Tommy, the cabin boy, does. I mean, really quite a different plot. It even has a Swiftian element where before he gets back home, they go to an island and they meet another group of people who are very mysterious. That wasn't working, and at that point, I really had to rethink the novel over again. I must say one thing is I never gave up on it. And the reason I never gave up on it is because the story was so compelling to me that I figured all I had to do was stay out of the way of the story. In other words, not impose myself, not get my own ideas necessarily in the way, but look at the characters, their ideas, their beliefs, and follow that as authentically as I could. So the effort is always, I believe, just to be a good midwife, to deliver the baby without damaging it in any sort of way and keep yourself out of it. That's why it took 6 years.
Does it mean that maybe one of the reasons this book has so much appeal is that it was special to you as a work, that this was a work that somehow stands out from everything else you've ever done to yourself?
Well, I guess in a sense you could say that. I had more fun doing this book than anything else. Even over a period of 6 years, I never got bored with it. The novel before that, Oxfording Tale, took 5, and I feel very strongly about that. When I talk to students, like at Evergreen College and other places, they tell me they think Oxfording Tale is a more sophisticated, more complex book, and they're quite right about that. Middle Passage is far simpler. It's
more accessible.
More accessible, which was my intention, and more straight-line linear than Oxfording Tale. And I have a great affection for both of the books. I'd like to see them as somewhat different, though.
Let me ask you about this just in a different direction, and that is, let's say you put all this time into researching, into writing. When do you know you're done? When do you know it's finished?
I think you know you're done, finally, when you cannot do any more. That is to say, if you change one sentence that you have written, or in a paragraph that you've gone over 20 times, you change that one sentence, it will disturb the sentence before it, it'll disturb the sentence after it, and the entire paragraph will collapse into this hole. You know you cannot change anything because you've worked it over in terms of meaning and music to the point where finally one syllable will disturb the entire organic unity. At that point, you know that paragraph cannot be touched anymore. You could substitute one word for another, a synonym, but you know you've got just the right word. If you go over something 20 times, that indeed will happen. With Oxfording Tale, that was 250 pages in manuscript. and I threw out 2,400 pages. I didn't count for middle passage, but I know it must have been somewhat similar. I revise a lot. I don't trust first drafts in my own case. I never do a good first draft. Third draft, if I'm lucky, okay, but usually 10th draft. And I enjoy that. I mean, it's like first thought is not best thought for me in creative writing. It's 20th thought.
If the book is at that stage when you finally birth it and let it out to the public, it must be hard to have people write criticisms of it. It must make it difficult to maybe not have people hear the music the same way.
Well, someone misunderstands a book after that many years. I was talking to a friend of mine, novelist Richard Wiley, about this. You work 3 years, 2 years, 10 years, and if someone misunderstands the book, you feel bad. You know, you sort of say, oh, gee, why didn't they get that? You know, but on other occasions, you discover reviewers see things that you yourself were not aware of. When you're working that hard and that focused, I believe, on a creative project, often you're using instinct, and there are levels of meaning that you're working on that you aren't even fully aware of, and a reviewer can pick that out, see connections that you didn't see necessarily. So I find good reviewers to be of great value to a novelist.
One of the things you always hear about writers and books is that writers bring a lot of themselves, who they are, their own personality into their writing. So what of you and your personality do we read about in Middle Passage?
Well, I think it's not just true of me, but I think I'm all over the book, as any writer would be. You have to be every character. Literally, every character has to be invested with some of your own emotional life, some aspect of you for that character to come alive. Now, I do research. Captain Falcon is more or less based upon Sir Richard Francis Burton, who fascinated me ever since I was a teenager. But by the same token, I had to try to understand, I suppose, what it means to be an arch Puritan and someone who is as rigid as he is. If you can immerse yourself in another character, all the characters, major ones, okay, then I think what you're able to do is create characters who are sympathetic, who the reader will be able to identify. If you do not immerse yourself in a character like that, that character will ring false. So I think the writer is everywhere in the text.
You know, you always hear about actors getting their own personalities confused with the characters that they play in films and on stage. Does that ever happen with writers?
Conceivably, but I would draw a real strong connection between what the actor does and what the novelist does. It's the same process. It really is. You must speak like that character and the rhythms of that character's voice. You must figure out how that character walks and is differentiated from every other character in the most minute details. The way that character eats a bowl of soup, say if it's Falcon, must be different from the way that Rutherford, you know, spoons the soup out. I mean, every little detail has got to reveal character, and you have to be able, I think, as an actor, you know, as a writer, actor, to inhabit the space of all those people, male and female, black and white, American and African. And that's what's, I think, so exciting about writing novels. It allows you to project outside of yourself during the period of the novel's creation.
What did you learn about yourself in writing this book? What kind of self-discovery did you go through?
What kind of self-discovery? That's a difficult one. I think what I discovered about that book, I guess, are a couple of things. It really is a love story. And Rutherford comes back to Isadora, and I was really working with strong feelings that I have for my own wife, who I've been married to for 20 years. We've been together 22. Balika, the little girl in the African girl he saves, is 8 years old, and she's sort of styled after my own daughter to a degree, Elizabeth. And my daughter says, no, she's not me, she's not me. And, you know, little things. And also, Rutherford is a patriot, I discovered. Even though he's on this terrible ship, he wants to get home. And where is home? It's Illinois. And that's where his loved ones are, his brother, right? And I guess I discovered something about my own affection for the American people, people I've known and loved ever since I was a kid, and the fact that they are anchored in a particular part of this nation.
Do you ever feel vulnerable when your works go to print? Do you feel like you're sort of standing there naked to the world?
Yeah. Writing has been described as a private act in a public place. There's nothing you can hide about yourself. It's always terrifying, you know, but once again, once it's done, and it goes through a year usually, in my case, of preparation and pre-book, you know, stuff before it comes out, by that time my mind is on the next book. And I'm looking back at the other one from a kind of psychological distance. Very curious to see how the world accepts the child I'm sending out. But also my mind is sort of looking forward as well as backwards at the same time.
You've done a lot of talking about Middle Passage over the last several months. I interviewed Dave Barry some time ago, and he said that after a while, especially you're on a book tour and you do a lot of interviews about the book, the way he put it was that you begin to look at your book as a large and loathsome insect that you just don't want to see anymore ever again. Do you get to a point where you're ready to move on and the rest of the world isn't?
Well, it is true, I guess. I mean, I worked on that book for 6 years. It must be 7 years old now for me, but it's new to other people. And so I'm really curious and interested in talking to people about it to see what their reaction is. I haven't gone stale on it, that's true, but I do have a certain distance. It isn't an insect for me or something, you know, a dog following me around that I have to, you know, worry about getting out of my way. I simply hope that other people enjoy it as much as I enjoyed writing it.
You know, a couple of the things that you've been working on as all of this has been going on, a couple of books of essays. You're still editing both of those.
Yes, 2 books of essays. One is called Black Writers on Writing, in which we have 12 contemporary prominent black authors talking about their development, their aesthetics, what they see happening in American literature. I think this will be a very useful book for helping people to understand that black writers, each and every one of them, has a different approach to his or her art. Then the other book, which is going to take a little bit longer, I believe, because of its nature, is tentatively called The Black Male in America, and focuses on that critical age group of young black males from 16 to 24 who are predominantly in the prisons rather than in college, whose lives are controlled by the criminal justice system, who die more often from murder than any other form, right, of death. And we have different kinds of people writing this, social anthropologists, historians, not so much creative writers, okay, but people who are concerned about this issue. And we hope their essays will shed new light on the question. It just won't be statistics, but creative approaches to solving the problem. And my co-editor for that is novelist John McCluskey at Indiana University, and Indiana University Press is doing both books.
Now, one of the things that you said after you won the National Book Award I found particularly fascinating. You made a prediction in your speech that night in the ballroom about black writing in the future, and a wonderfully optimistic and lovely statement saying that you saw very exciting times ahead, a greater generosity artistically ahead.
This is my hope. Those lines, actually, I took from Being and Race, Black Writing Since 1970. That book I did a few years ago. But I do hope, in fact, that the 90s will see a different kind of black American fiction. We have had signs. I think Middle Passage and its reception is indicative of that. But also, I would point out the success and of a book by Stanley Crouch called Notes of a Hanging Judge, which is also a nominee for the National Critics Book Circle, and the very controversial book by Shelby Steele called The Content of Our Character, which again is a nominee for the National Critics Book Circle. Those books are asking us to look again at what it means to be black in America. The definition of what it means to be black is not as rigid anymore. It's a little bit more malleable, it's a little bit more plastic, and we can again, I believe, in the 90s, go back to fundamental questions of what does it mean to simply be a human being, who is black, to explore elements of our culture that were not explored in the last 20 years. So I believe our discussion, our dialogue is going to open up, and our literature will be sort of a cutting edge in making that possible.
At the same time that you feel black culture is becoming more multifaceted to those who view it, yes. What about you personally? Has there been any tendency in winning this award to go from being a black writer to being the black writer, and all of a sudden you're supposed to represent 30 million Americans?
Well, if that is happening, I'm resisting it. I don't believe that's possible. I'm one writer, and I write one way. We have maybe 100 black American novelists and short story writers in this country, and some of them are my friends. And I know how each one of them is different and unique, and I would never want that uniqueness to be lost. No one would ever approach you and say, is John Updike the spokesman for your race. Okay? I mean, I'm not sure how you would react to that, but the question is preposterous, right? So why should someone approach me and say, oh, are you the spokesman for your race? Well, no, what I am is a writer who tries to address questions that I hope are important to Black Americans, but I'm not the only writer who does that. And there are other people who write about Black American life in other ways better than I can. There are some who write political stories far better than I could do. There are some who write about the South far better than I can because I didn't grow up in the South. I grew up in the Midwest. So I think we have to get away from this idea that one person has to be top dog and look at a family of books that are all addressing questions of importance and not just elevate one person to prominence.
I want to ask you, you've been given the first endowed professorship in creative writing at the University of Washington. What does that mean?
I'm not sure yet. It won't kick in until the fall when I return. What it means, I think, in a larger sense than me, is that the creative writing program has been acknowledged for its importance to not just the English department, but to the university and to Northwest Writing. I will hold that position for as long as I'm qualified to do so, and then in the future it will pass to somebody else. That endowed professorship is there. I think it says to anyone who sees it that the University of Washington takes creative writing seriously.
And what does that mean to you just in terms of your work? Does it give you greater freedom? It certainly must give you greater security.
Well, it's an honor. I'm very flattered to hold that position. It buys me a little bit more writing time, which is very important to me at this point in my life. And it also will help me, I really hope, to promote the work of our graduate students and other writers I know around the country with a little bit more vigor, perhaps.
And I can well imagine that the classes will be filling up early and to the maximum for the classes that you'll be teaching starting in the fall.
I hope so.
Well, Charles Johnson, as always, a great pleasure to talk to you. And we've talked fleetingly about Middle Passage. It's my hope that anyone watching this who hasn't read Middle Passage yet does so. And we, of course, look forward so much to what comes next.
Thank you, Marcia.
Congratulations and best wishes.
To see more UWTV classics, visit uwtv.org/classics.